December 7th, 1941. You know the phrase, a date which will live in infamy. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, it just catapulted the United States straight into World War II. I mean, it was a moment of absolute catastrophic shock for the American public. And until 9/11, it was actually the single deadliest attack ever carried out on U.S. territory.
That's right. But when you dig into the history, the lead up to that Sunday morning, you find this really fascinating paradox.
Right.
For most Americans, it felt totally unprovoked, almost like a random act of aggression coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was definitely the feeling.
But, for the policymakers, the diplomats, the people who'd been watching the situation unfold in the Pacific for years, even decades, well, for them, it felt almost grimly inevitable, like the tragic end of a long escalating crisis.
And that paradox is exactly what we need to unpack in this deep dive.
It is. Our sources, they really showed that the attack wasn't just impulsive. It was the final desperate move in a very long, very high-stakes game Japan felt it was playing.
A game they felt they were losing.
Precisely. Japan was on a hard clock. They were facing potential economic collapse. And, well, the hardliners believed striking first was their only chance, their only path to survival as they saw it.
So to understand the real reasons Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, we have to look beyond just the events of that one day.
Exactly. We need to look past the smoke, the fury. Our mission today is to synthesize these materials we've gathered and really uncover the complex web of motivations, the decisions, the miscalculations that led Japan to this point. We've sort of organized this road to war into 4 critical threads for you. It shows how things like resource scarcity combine with a potent ideology to create a national crisis that just kept escalating.
Okay, so what are those threads?
First, we're going to trace Japan's incredible transformation. It's almost superhuman, really. The rapid modernization, the industrialization, the Meiji transformation.
Right, how they went from this isolated feudal nation to basically a colonial power in, less than 50 years?
Astonishingly fast, yes. Second, we'll track the growth of Japanese expansionism, the rise of militarism, and this very potent ultranationalism. And we need to pay close attention here to something called Gekokujo, this kind of toxic culture of junior officer insubordination. It completely undermined civilian rule and made compromise almost impossible later on.
Gekokujo. Okay, got it. Then what's third?
Third, we dive into the diplomacy, or rather, the failure of diplomacy, that high-stakes game of chicken with the United States. We'll analyze the, frankly, devastating failures of intelligence and communication that ended up empowering the military hardliners in Tokyo.
And the final thread.
Finally, we look at the attack plan itself, Operation Z. This was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's huge gamble. He was a man who, interestingly, really understood American power, probably better than most in Japan.
But he still went ahead.
He did. He was willing to risk absolutely everything on a perfect opening strike. A strike he secretly suspected might not be enough if the war dragged on, which he thought it probably would.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Where do we start? The 19th century. How did this isolated island nation even get into a position to challenge the West?
Right. So you have to picture Japan before, say, 1850. It's agrarian, it's feudal, a mountainous island nation, very isolated under the Tokugawa shogunate.
That's the military government, the warlords, right?
Exactly. They'd been ruling for over 200 years. And crucially, Japan lacked the raw materials, iron, coal, and later oil, the stuff you needed for the new industrial age. They were intentionally keeping themselves separate, that policy of sukoku, national seclusion.
But the world was changing rapidly outside their borders.
Massively. The mid-19th century saw this huge shift in global power. The Industrial Revolution had created these massive Western colonial empires.
Fueled by steam engines, mass steel production.
Advanced weaponry. And they were hungry for new markets, new resources. They were spreading across Asia. Japan, stuck in its old ways technologically, was incredibly vulnerable.
And then came the knock on the door.
A very loud knock. 1852. American President Millard Fillmore sends Commodore Matthew C. Perry. He sails right into Edo Bay, that's modern Tokyo Bay, with 4 heavily armed, steam-powered warships.
The black ships.
The Korofen, yeah, the black ships. The Japanese were absolutely terrified. The smoke pouring from the steam engines, the cannons. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen.
It represented overwhelming power.
Completely. Perry basically demanded Japan end its 200-year isolation, open its ports to American ships, and the threat was clear: cooperate or face bombardment.
So they had no choice, really.
None. They were forced to sign these unequal treaties that heavily favored the U.S. Perry's arrival wasn't just a political loss, it was a deep national humiliation. It showed the shogunate couldn't protect the nation anymore.
And they had a warning sign right next door, didn't they? China.
A huge, terrifying warning sign. While Japan had been closed off, China, the ancient center of Asian civilization and economy, was collapsing. This was the start of its century of humiliation.
Right, the Opium Wars, losing territory.
Exactly. The Qing dynasty was riddled with internal conflict, but strategically it just couldn't handle Western exploitation. The British East India Company forced opium on them, China tried to resist and got crushed.
And the result? Losing Hong Kong to Britain, huge chunks of land to Russia.
Yes. And our sources argue China's failure wasn't just military, it was intellectual arrogance, a kind of pervasive contempt for foreigners, as one author puts it.
They underestimated the threat.
They failed to grasp that Western power wasn't just about better guns, it was a fundamentally different system. Industrial, political, economic. Japan watched this disaster unfold and realized radical change wasn't optional, it was survival.
Which leads us to 1868. The Meiji Restoration.
Correct. A group of reformers, mostly younger samurai and nobles, realized the shogunate was finished. They launched a revolt, won the Boshin War pretty decisively, overthrew the warlords.
And they brought back the emperor.
They installed the 15-year-old Emperor Meiji, not as a direct ruler in the old sense, but as the symbolic figurehead, the legitimizer for a completely new regime. They moved the capital from Kyoto to Tokyo.
And their strategy was copy the West.
Ruthlessly pragmatic is how I'd describe it. They knew they didn't have time to reinvent everything. They ramped up translating Western scientific texts, legal books. But the key move was the Iwakura mission.
Tell us about that.
It was incredible. A 2-year round-the-world trip, about 50 top statesmen, scholars traveling through 12 countries, the US, Britain, Germany, France.
What were they looking for? Just technology?
No, much deeper than that. They weren't just shopping for machines. They were doing a deep dive into the foundations of Western power. Civil codes, economic structures, parliaments, education systems.
They wanted the whole package.
Exactly. And their big takeaway, which is absolutely critical for understanding the next 70 years, was that just buying Western tech wasn't enough. You needed the institutions that created and supported that tech.
So things like parliaments, civil services.
Merit-based civil services, strong universities, legal systems. That's where the real strength lay, they concluded, not just in the battleships.
They move fast.
Unbelievably fast. Compulsory elementary education was introduced. Tokyo Imperial University was founded. Politically, they adopted a model largely based on Britain.
A cabinet system, a parliament.
Yes, the Diet, they called it. A modern constitution in 1889 establishing rule of law. Economically, the Bank of Japan was set up in 82. Railways were built. You started seeing districts like Tokyo's Marunouchi being called Little London with all the modern brick buildings.
But this must have caused huge social upheaval, tearing down centuries of tradition.
Massive disruption. Imagine your whole way of life, your social structure just completely overturned in a generation. It caused enormous cultural stress, discontent, resistance even.
So how did the reformers keep control? How did they make this radical change stick?
They used something called state Shinto. It was a brilliant, though ultimately quite dangerous political maneuver.
Shinto, that's the traditional Japanese belief system.
Right. And a core part of it was the idea that the emperor was divine, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The reformers seized on this.
How?
By framing the new government and all its modern Western-style policies as flowing directly from the divine emperor's will. He became the single, unchallengeable source of authority.
Ah, so it wasn't just some politicians changing things. It was the emperor's sacred decree.
Precisely. It solved the problem of loyalty. Before, allegiance was local to your feudal lord, the shogun. Now loyalty was redirected entirely to this remote divine figure in Tokyo.
And the state Shinto became, what, a kind of national glue?
An essential social glue, yes.
Yeah.
It fostered this intense ultra-nationalism demanding absolute devotion from every citizen. It legitimized any policy, any sacrifice if it was done in the emperor's name. It held the rapidly changing society together.
And the final piece of the puzzle, military power.
Absolutely. The reformers understood all the great Western powers had empires and strong militaries to acquire and defend them. So military modernization followed the best Western blueprints.
Who did they copy?
For the army, they looked straight to Prussia. Highly disciplined, efficient. They introduced conscription in 1873, the old samurai class. Their status was abolished, but many became officers in the new Imperial Japanese Army.
And the Navy.
That was modeled directly on the British Royal Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world. There was this idea, pushed by General Yamagata Aritomo, that Japan needed to become a floating fortress, projecting power outwards.
Did it work? Did they build a strong navy quickly?
Remarkably so. By the turn of the 20th century, they had over 30 modern warships, a serious force.
So just to recap this first part, in a few short decades, Japan goes from isolated feudalism to a modern, industrialized nation with a powerful military, a centralized government legitimized by divine authority, and crucially, the ambition to join the ranks of the great colonial powers.
That's the astonishing story of the Meiji transformation. It set the stage for everything that followed.
Okay, so Japan has modernized, built up its military. What's the first move? Where do they look to expand?
Immediately, they look outward. The old Qing dynasty in China was weakening, creating a kind of power vacuum in East Asia. Japan was eager, almost desperate, to prove its new status. The first target was Korea.
Why Korea specifically?
Strategically vital, Japan saw it as, quote, a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. They felt they needed it as a buffer zone, a staging base for potential future expansion on the mainland.
And there was another power pushing into the region too, right?
Yes, Russia. Russia was building the Trans-Siberian Railway, planning to extend its influence deep into Manchuria and Korea. That was a direct threat Japan felt it had to counter.
So this leads to war with China.
The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-95, Japan's new modern army and navy completely overwhelmed the Chinese forces.
And the result?
A decisive victory for Japan. They gained control over Korea, they annexed the island of Formosa, modern Taiwan, and importantly, the Liaodong Peninsula in southern Manchuria. Japan had officially arrived as an imperial power.
But celebrations didn't last long.
Not at all. The established Western powers were alarmed. Russia, Germany, and France teamed up in what's known as the Triple Intervention.
What did they do?
They issued a joint ultimatum, basically backed by the threat of force, demanding Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to China.
After Japan had just won it in a war, that must have stung.
It was a profound humiliation, a deep source of resentment. The Japanese felt they'd played by the West's rules, modernized, built an army, won a war, and were still being treated as second-class citizens, pushed around.
And Russia took the peninsula anyway later.
Exactly. Just 3 years later, Russia strong-armed China into leasing the Liaodong Peninsula, including Port Arthur, to them. This just crystallized a dangerous belief in Japan. The West couldn't be trusted, diplomacy was weak, only military power commanded respect.
So Japan doubles down on militarization.
Absolutely. They poured money into the army and navy, preparing for what they saw as the inevitable clash with Russia over dominance in Northeast Asia.
Which brings us to the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905.
Yes. The core conflict was over Manchuria, that resource-rich region in China. Essential for Japan's industrial growth: coal, iron, timber. Russia had occupied it after the Boxer Rebellion and wasn't leaving.
How did the war start?
When diplomacy failed, Japan launched a surprise torpedo attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. Sound familiar?
Very. A preemptive strike.
It set the tone. The war was brutal, but the defining moment came at sea. The Battle of Tsushima in 1905.
What happened there?
The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed literally halfway around the world to relieve their forces. Admiral Togo Hihachiro, leading the Japanese fleet, absolutely annihilated them. A stunning victory.
This must have been huge news globally.
Typical, it cemented Japan as the dominant power in Asia. And crucially, it was the first time in the modern age that an Asian nation had decisively defeated a major European power. The psychological impact was immense, both in Asia and the West.
And there's a direct link here to Pearl Harbor, isn't there?
A critical one. A 21-year-old naval officer named Isoroku Yamamoto was wounded at Tsushima. He witnessed Togo's victory firsthand.
The future Admiral Yamamoto.
The very same. He didn't just see a victory, he internalized the incredible strategic value of a decisive surprise knockout blow against a potentially superior foe. That lesson, the need for a perfect opening strike, stayed with him.
So Japan wins, gets control of southern Manchuria, the railways. Military expansion seems to be working perfectly for them.
It seemed that way. But again, the West intervened, mediating the peace treaty, the Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by Teddy Roosevelt, ensuring Japan didn't gain too much, limiting their gains. Still, the military's prestige soared.
Then comes World War I. Japan sides with the Allies.
They did. They used the opportunity to seize German colonial possessions in China, the Shandong province, and islands across the Pacific. They contributed to the Allied war effort.
But they fell slighted again afterwards.
Deeply. At the Versailles peace talks, Japan proposed a racial equality clause be included in the League of Nations covenant. It was rejected, largely due to opposition from the U.S. and Australia.
Racial equality rejected, and then the U.S. immigration law.
Yes, in 1924, the U.S. passed an immigration act that effectively banned all Japanese immigration. These weren't just minor diplomatic setbacks. They were seen as profound insults. They reinforced that deep-seated feeling of inferiority, that sense that no matter what Japan achieved, the West would never treat them as equals.
And this fuels the hardliners.
Absolutely. It confirmed their belief that diplomacy was useless, that the West was fundamentally racist and determined to hold Japan down. This coincides with a major power shift inside Japan.
How so?
The original Meiji leaders, the ones who drove the initial modernization, they were aging, dying off. Their influence waned. Who filled the vacuum? The military.
Bolstered by all these victories.
And fueled by that state Shinto ideology, the divine emperor narrative. By the early 1920s, the army and navy chiefs had managed to establish that they answered only to the emperor, not the prime minister or the civilian government.
That seems unstable.
Hugely unstable. It created this dual government system we talked about. And this military ideology, pushed by thinkers like Yusuke Shinki, started framing expansionism not just as strategic necessity, but as Japan's sacred mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Compromise became almost treasonous.
And then Emperor Hirohito comes to the throne.
He ascends in 1926, just as the world is about to plunge into economic chaos. The Wall Street crash of '29, the Great Depression.
Which hits Japan hard.
Devastatingly hard. Remember, they'd built this export-oriented economy. When the U.S. passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, it triggered a global trade war. Protectionism went up everywhere.
What happened to Japanese exports? Silk, for example.
Plummeted. Overall, exports dropped by 50%, but in key sectors like silk, which was vital for rural farmers, sales to the U.S. fell by close to 80%. It caused widespread poverty, unemployment, social unrest.
And the military had an answer.
A simple, seductive one. Conquest. They argued Japan had to seize resource-rich territories, create its own self-sufficient economic bloc, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere free from Western tariffs and trade manipulation. Manchuria was the key.
And this is where the young officers in Gekokujo come back in.
Exactly. This idea of Gekokujo, the low overthrowing the high, was deeply embedded, especially in the army. Junior officers, often intensely nationalistic and frustrated with perceived government weakness, felt they had a patriotic duty to act decisively, even if it meant disobeying direct orders.
They could force the government's hand.
That was the idea. Initiate an incident, create facts on the ground, and rely on the ensuing patriotic fervor and the senior command's reluctance to punish success to make it stick.
Which leads to the Mukden incident.
September 1931. Junior officers in the Kwantung Army, the Japanese force stationed in southern Manchuria, staged an explosion on a section of the Japanese-owned South Manchuria Railway near Mukden.
They blew up their own railway.
Yes. Blamed it on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion and occupation of Manchuria.
Did the government in Tokyo approve this?
No. The civilian government was horrified. They opposed the invasion. But the Kwantung Army officers simply ignored them. The senior military command back in Tokyo, while maybe initially unhappy about the insubordination, didn't intervene effectively because the operation was succeeding.
So Gekokujo worked.
It worked again and again. This constant pattern made genuine civilian control over the military basically impossible.
What did the rest of the world do?
The League of Nations investigated, condemned Japan, demanded withdrawal. Japan's response. They walked out of the League in 1933. Total defiance.
But they kept Manchuria.
They established the puppet state of Manchukuo, and from their perspective, it was a huge success. By 1943, Manchukuo was an industrial powerhouse, producing, according to some sources, nearly 99% of China's oil at the time, 93% of its steel, 87% of pig iron.
So the militarist argument conquest brings prosperity seemed proven right.
It seemed completely vindicated to many in Japan, especially the military, which of course only emboldened them further.
Leading to more conflict in China.
Directly. The success in Manchuria fueled ambitions for more. In 1937, another staged incident, the Marco Polo Bridge incident near Beijing, was used as a pretext to launch a full-scale invasion of China proper. The Second Sino-Japanese War began.
Did they expect another quick victory?
They did. They fundamentally underestimated Chinese nationalism and resilience. Instead of collapsing, China's warring factions, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, KMT, and Mao Zedong's communists, CCP, actually formed a temporary united front to resist Japan.
So Japan got bogged down.
Massively bogged down. What they thought would be a quick war turned into a vast, brutal, seemingly endless war of attrition across the massive landscape of China.
What were the costs?
Huge. By 1941, before Pearl Harbor, Japan had already suffered something like 600,000 casualties in China. The war was consuming the national budget. Nearly 80% of government spending was going to the military by then. And critically, this endless war dramatically worsened Japan's biggest vulnerability: oil.
Because they needed fuel for the planes, the ships, the tanks.
Everything. Their reliance on imported oil, mostly from the United States, soared, from around 67% in the mid-30s to a staggering 90% by 1939. Their entire military machine, their entire empire, now rested on a fragile supply line of foreign oil.
And we also have to mention the brutality in China, the rape of Nanking.
Yes, it's essential context. Reports of horrific atrocities committed by Japanese troops, like the mass killings and assaults in Nanking in 1937, where estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of civilians were murdered, reached the West.
How did that impact perceptions?
It fundamentally hardened attitudes, particularly in the U.S. Japan wasn't just seen as an ambitious rival anymore, but as a barbaric aggressor state. This shaped the American public's view, and crucially, the views of policymakers like Roosevelt and Hull. It made compromise much harder to stomach.
Okay, so Japan is bogged down in China, increasingly desperate for resources, especially oil, and relying heavily on imports from the U.S. What was the U.S. position during all this?
Well, the U.S. had established interests in the Pacific going back to the Spanish-American War in 1898. They'd acquired Guam, the Philippines. Their main policy was the open-door policy.
What was that about?
Primarily, it aimed to protect China's territorial integrity and sovereignty, but also, crucially, to ensure all nations had equal access to trade and investment in China's huge market, basically stopping any single power, like Japan, from dominating China.
Did the U.S. try to contain Japan earlier?
They did, through diplomacy and international agreements. There were naval limitation treaties in the 1920s, trying to cap the size of the major navies, prevent a costly arms race. They also got Japan to agree, reluctantly, to return the Shandong province to China after WWI.
But Japan resented these limitations.
Deeply. They saw it as the West dictating terms, keeping them subordinate. The assassination of Prime Minister Hara Takashi in 1921, who supported those naval treaties, was a stark warning sign of how powerful the anti-compromise militarist factions were becoming even then.
What about President Roosevelt, FDR? What was his approach initially?
Early on, FDR largely followed a policy of non-intervention, the good neighbor policy. But as Japan's aggression escalated the invasion of Manchuria, then China proper, his concern grew significantly.
So he started supporting China.
Yes. It started subtly, refusing to formally recognize Manchukuo. Then it became more direct. Loans to Chiang Kai-shek's government, allowing American volunteer pilots, the famous Flying Tigers, to fight for China, sending arms and supplies along the Burma Road.
When did things really start to heat up between the U.S. and Japan?
The turning point was 1940. Germany's blitzkrieg smashed through Western Europe. France fell. The Netherlands was occupied. Britain was fighting for survival.
And Japan saw an opportunity.
A massive one. The European colonial powers were completely distracted. Their resource-rich colonies in Southeast Asia, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, looked suddenly vulnerable.
Especially the oil, rubber, tin.
Exactly. The resources Japan desperately needed to escape reliance on the U.S. and fuel its war in China. So Japan began making aggressive moves southward.
How did FDR react?
In July 1940, he took his first major step. He signed the Export Control Act. This allowed him to restrict or halt exports of strategic materials. He started by limiting aviation fuel, scrap iron, and steel exports to Japan.
A warning shot.
Definitely. It was intended to curb Japan's aggression without provoking an all-out conflict, trying to use economic pressure as a diplomatic tool.
How did Japan respond to that?
With defiance and escalation. In September 1940, Japan formally signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy.
Joining the Axis powers.
Yes, this was a direct warning to the United States. It basically said, If you tangle with Japan militarily, you're also at war with Germany and Italy. They were raising the stakes significantly.
Did this deter Japan's move south?
Not at all. In fact, there was internal debate in Japan. Germany was urging them to attack the Soviet Union, especially after Hitler invaded Russia in June 1941.
To relieve pressure on the German Eastern Front.
Right. But the Japanese military leadership, especially War Minister Hideki Tojo, prioritized the southern resource area. They calculated they needed Indonesian oil more than they needed to help Hitler fight Stalin. Survival depended on resources, not Axis solidarity.
So they pushed further south.
Yes. In July 1941, they took the decisive step. They pressured the Vichy French government, the Nazi-controlled regime in France, into allowing Japanese troops to occupy southern French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia.
And for the U.S., this was the final straw.
This was the line in the sand. From southern Indochina, Japan could easily launch attacks on the Philippines, Malaya, and crucially, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. Roosevelt felt he had to act decisively.
And he did.
He did. Later that same month, July 1941, Roosevelt delivered the crippling blow. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States. He halted all trade. And most critically, he imposed a complete embargo on all oil exports to Japan.
A total oil embargo.
Total. And Britain and the Dutch East Indies immediately followed suit. This became known in Japan as the ABCD encirclement: America, Britain, China, Dutch.
What did this mean for Japan, practically?
Catastrophe. As we said, Japan imported 90% of its oil, mostly from the U.S. Their domestic reserves were limited. Our sources confirm the internal estimates. At their current wartime consumption rates, they had maybe 18 months, perhaps 2 years of oil left, max.
So the clock was ticking down to zero.
The entire war machine, the Navy, the Air Force, the economy itself, faced paralysis within a year and a half.
Did Roosevelt know this embargo might lead to war?
Oh, absolutely. He was explicitly warned by his own Navy War Plans Division. They told him the embargo would likely force Japan to attack Malaya and the Dutch East Indies within months, and that the U.S. would almost certainly be drawn in.
But he did it anyway. Why?
It was a calculated risk. FDR felt that letting Japan seize the resources of Southeast Asia without a fight would make them an unstoppable Pacific power later. He preferred to risk war now on somewhat his own terms, rather than wait until Japan was even stronger and potentially self-sufficient in oil.
Now let's flip to the Japanese perspective here. How did they see this embargo?
They saw it as an act of naked aggression, unacceptable, hypocritical even.
Hypocritical how?
Well, from their viewpoint, the U.S. and Britain had built vast global empires through conquest over centuries, securing all the resources they needed. Now, just as Japan was trying to do the same thing, secure its own resource base for survival, as they framed it, the established powers were using economic strangulation to stop them.
Was that view justified?
Justified is tricky. It was certainly effective political framing within Japan, but the feeling of being cornered, of being strangled, was absolutely genuine. The embargo presented them with an existential crisis.
What were their options?
Basically 3. 1. Retreat completely from China and Indochina, abandon their imperial ambitions. That was totally unacceptable to the military and politically impossible. 2. Try to negotiate a compromise with the U.S. to get the oil flowing again. 3. Seize the resources they needed by force, which meant attacking the European colonies and, likely, the U.S. Pacific Fleet.
So they tried diplomacy first.
Yes, but with that 18-month clock ticking very, very loudly in the background. And the military was already drawing up plans for option 3.
So Japan is under this crippling oil embargo. The clock is ticking. Who leads the diplomatic effort?
The task fell primarily to the civilian prime minister, Prince Konoe Fumimaro. Konoe was an aristocrat, perhaps a bit indecisive, but he was also pragmatic. He understood America's industrial power and genuinely believed a war with the U.S. would be disastrous for Japan. He wanted a deal.
But he faced that internal problem, right? The dual government.
Exactly. That's the crucial context. Konoe headed the civilian cabinet, but he had zero direct control over the military's supreme command. They answered only to Emperor Hirohito. They could veto any policy, and they were the ones setting the deadlines for war preparations if diplomacy failed.
How did Konoe try to manage the military?
It was a delicate balancing act. He actually appointed General Hideki Tojo, a known hardliner, as his war minister. The thinking, perhaps naively, was that having a tough army man inside the cabinet might help control the even more radical junior officers out in the field, the ones pushing for immediate war.
Did the military give Konoe any room to negotiate?
They reluctantly agreed to let him pursue talks with Washington, but they imposed a strict deadline for a diplomatic breakthrough. Initially, it was around October 10, 1941. If no deal by then, military action would proceed.
What was Konoe's main diplomatic idea?
He believed the only way to break the deadlock, to cut through the layers of bureaucracy and suspicion before the military's deadline expired, was a face-to-face meeting, a personal summit between himself and President Roosevelt.
Did he propose this?
Yes. He sent the formal request to U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull in early August 1941.
How did Hull react?
With deep suspicion. Hull was a stern, moralistic figure. He fundamentally distrusted the Japanese government, viewing them as deceitful aggressors because of Manchuria and China.
And the U.S. had an advantage here, didn't they? The code breaking.
A huge advantage, or perhaps disadvantage, depending on how you look at it. U.S. intelligence had cracked Japan's main diplomatic cipher, codenamed Magic. So Hull and Roosevelt were reading Japan's confidential instructions to its ambassadors, their internal assessments.
That should have helped diplomacy, shouldn't it? Knowing their real position.
You'd think so, but here's where it gets complicated. The Magic intercepts often seem to confirm Hull's existing bias. He saw messages discussing fallback positions or military timetables as proof the Japanese were just stalling, playing for time while preparing to attack.
So the intelligence fueled the distrust.
It created a vicious cycle. Roosevelt himself, while maybe more flexible than Hull, saw the intercepts and thought, well, even if diplomacy fails, maybe we can baby them along for 3 months, buying precious time for the U.S. military, especially the Navy in the Philippines, to build up its strength. This inevitably slowed things down on the U.S. side.
Did Hull agree to the summit Konoe we wanted?
No. Hull dismissed the idea. He insisted Japan must make significant, concrete concessions before any summit could even be considered. Show good faith first.
What concessions did Konoe offer?
Konoe was desperate. He knew time was running out. Japan was burning through its irreplaceable oil reserves every single day, something like 12,000 tons a day. In late August, he made a significant offer. Japan would pledge not to advance further south, would respect Soviet borders, and, importantly, would agree in principle to Hull's own stated 4 basic principles for international conduct, things like territorial integrity, non-interference.
That sounds promising.
It should have been. But Hull remained unmoved. He was heavily influenced by his chief advisor on Asia, Stanley Hornbeck. Hornbeck was intensely anti-Japanese, viewing any diplomatic outreach as a trick.
Was anyone arguing for diplomacy, for taking Konoe seriously?
Yes. The U.S. ambassador in Tokyo, Joseph C. Grew. Grew was a seasoned diplomat. He'd been in Japan for years. He understood the political dynamics, the psychology, the immense pressure Konoe was under from the military.
What did Grew advise?
Grew sent urgent cables back to Washington. He stressed that Konoe's desire for a summit was sincere, that it represented the last best chance for peace. He warned that delaying or rejecting Konoe would utterly discredit the civilian peace faction and inevitably lead to unbridled acts by the military hardliners.
How did Washington react to Grew's warnings?
They were largely dismissed. Hornbeck basically painted Grew as naive, as having gone native, being too sympathetic to the Japanese position. Hull trusted Hornbeck and the seemingly cold, hard facts from the Magic intercepts more than his own ambassador on the ground. And adding to the confusion, the Magic intercepts themselves weren't perfect. There were occasional but critical translation issues.
Like what?
Well, one source highlights a key message from Foreign Minister Tojo back in Tokyo. He described relations with the U.S. as being on the verge of rupture, but the translation provided to Hull rendered it as relations have reached the edge.
That sounds much more final, more hostile.
Exactly. It's a subtle shift, but at that tense moment, it likely reinforced the American perception that Japan had already decided on war and was just going through the motions diplomatically. These small errors compounded the mistrust.
So what was Hull's ultimate demand? The deal breaker.
After weeks of back and forth, Hull laid down the core U.S. condition. Japan must agree to an immediate and complete withdrawal of all its troops from China. Not just the recent incursions, but from Manchuria, too. Everything.
How did that go down in Tokyo?
When Konoe presented this demand to his cabinet, War Minister Tojo exploded. Absolutely refused. He argued that a complete withdrawal from China after years of fighting and sacrifice was unthinkable. It would be a total humiliation, a defeat of Japan.
Tojo sought his surrender.
He genuinely believed the U.S. wasn't negotiating in good faith, that they were using the embargo to stall while demanding terms designed to break Japan without firing a shot. He wouldn't accept it.
So Konoe was stuck.
Completely. He couldn't meet the American demand without Tojo's agreement, and Tojo would never agree. Realizing negotiation was impossible under these conditions, Konoe resigned as prime minister on October 16, 1941.
That seems like a point of no return.
It was a fatal blow to the peace process, and what happened next was incredibly consequential.
Who replaced Konoe?
The emperor's chief advisor, Kido Koichi, made a desperate gamble. He advised Emperor Hirohito to appoint General Tojo himself as the new prime minister.
The hardliner, why?
Kido's logic was risky but understandable in the circumstances. He hoped that by putting the disciplined, army-focused Tojo in charge, they could actually control the more fanatical, potentially rogue elements within the military, especially the young officers pushing for immediate, unauthorized action. Maybe Tojo's authority could keep them in line.
Did Tojo accept?
He did. And critically, he also remained war minister. This combined role made him the most powerful figure in the nation, second only to the emperor himself.
But was there any last attempt at peace?
Yes, and this is fascinating. Kido made one final crucial move. He arranged for Emperor Hirohito, who usually stayed above politics, to personally instruct Tojo, upon appointing him, to essentially rip up the existing plans and re-examine the possibility of peace, to go back to blank paper.
Did Tojo obey the emperor?
Tojo was devoutly loyal to the emperor. He reluctantly agreed to make one more diplomatic push, despite his own deep skepticism about American intentions. The clock, however, was ticking even faster now.
What was the final Japanese offer?
The new foreign minister, Shigenori Togo, drafted what became known as Proposal B. It offered some concessions. Japan would halt further southward expansion and would agree to withdraw troops from southern Indochina eventually, once the war in China was settled.
And in return?
In return, the U.S. must unfreeze Japanese assets and, most importantly, lift the oil embargo, at least partially, restore some level of trade.
Did the Japanese military agree to this?
Reluctantly. They saw it as a major climb down. But under pressure from the emperor, they agreed to let Togo present Proposal B. However, they attached a final, absolute, non-negotiable deadline. A deal had to be reached by December 1st, 1941. After that, the war machine would roll.
What was the American response to Proposal B?
Roosevelt actually considered a temporary solution, a stopgap measure called the modus vivendi. It would have eased the oil embargo slightly for maybe 6 months, in return for Japan halting aggression and pulling back from southern Indochina. It wasn't a full solution, but it might have bought time.
Why didn't that happen?
It faced immediate, fierce opposition. Winston Churchill in Britain objected, fearing it looked like appeasement. But the strongest opposition came from Chiang Kai-shek in China. He vehemently protested that any deal that eased pressure on Japan without forcing a full withdrawal from China was a betrayal. FDR, needing Allied unity, backed down from the modus vivendi.
So no compromise deal. What happened next?
Then came the final blow to diplomacy. Hull received another critical magic intercept. This one indicated Japan had set a hard deadline for negotiations November 29th. For Hull, this was absolute confirmation that Japan was negotiating in bad faith, that war was inevitable and imminent.
Did he consult the military?
Critically, no. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall and Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark actually wanted more time, maybe 4 months, to fully prepare U.S. forces, especially in the Philippines. But Hull, convinced Japan was about to strike anyway, decided to bypass them and issue a final definitive American position.
A Hull note?
Delivered on November 26, 1941. It wasn't really a negotiation proposal, it was effectively an ultimatum. It reiterated the demand for the immediate and complete withdrawal of all Japanese forces, military, naval, air, even police, from both China and Indochina. No compromises.
How did the Japanese ambassadors in Washington react?
They were stunned. They read the Hull note and saw it as deliberately impossible terms. It demanded Japan surrender everything it had fought for over the past decade, a complete political and military capitulation.
They saw as proof the U.S. was never serious about negotiating.
Exactly. They cabled back to Tokyo that the Hull note was clearly an ultimatum, confirming their worst fears that the U.S. had just been stalling all along, waiting for the embargo to cripple Japan.
And the final decision?
On December 1st, 1941, after receiving the ambassador's assessment of the Hull note, an imperial conference was held in Tokyo. Faced with what they perceived as an impossible ultimatum and the looming deadline of economic collapse from the oil embargo, Emperor Hirohito gave his final assent. The decision for war was made. From Japan's perspective, economic strangulation had left them, as they saw it, with only one choice: strike first to seize the resources they needed, or face national ruin.
So, war is decided. The diplomatic track is dead. Now the military plan kicks in. Who's masterminding the Japanese strategy?
The key figure here is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. And Yamamoto is a fascinating, complex figure.
Yeah, complex.
Because unlike many of the Army hardliners, Yamamoto actually knew the United States quite well. He'd studied at Harvard, he served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., he spoke English, he understood American culture, and more importantly, he understood America's immense industrial potential. He was also apparently a very skilled poker player.
So he knew the odds were against Japan in a long war.
He knew it absolutely. He famously warned Prime Minister Konoe back in early 1941. He said something like, Japan could run wild and win victory upon victory for the first 6 months, maybe a year. But if the war dragged on longer than that, Yamamoto said, I have no expectation of success.
Why? The industrial imbalance.
It was terrifying. The ratios were just overwhelming. Something like 20-to-1 in steel production in favor of the U.S., over 100-to-1 in oil production. Japan simply could not compete in a prolonged war of industrial attrition. Yamamoto knew this better than almost anyone.
So if he knew Japan couldn't win a long war, why did he plan the attack on Pearl Harbor? How did he justify it?
It was a massive gamble, a calculated, expert poker player's move, you might say. Operation Z, the Pearl Harbor attack plan, wasn't designed to win the war outright. It was designed to buy time.
Buy time for what?
It was based on that lesson he learned back at Tsushima, watching Admiral Togo crush the Russians. Yamamoto believed Japan's only hope was a devastating, crippling surprise attack right at the outset.
A knockout blow.
Exactly. Crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet in its main base before war was even formally declared. This, he hoped, would achieve two things. First, it would demoralize the American public, maybe leading to a negotiated peace favorable to Japan. Second, and more realistically, it would neutralize the U.S. Navy long enough that crucial 6 months to a year he talked about for Japan to achieve its primary strategic goal.
Which was seizing the resources in Southeast Asia.
Precisely. While the U.S. Navy was reeling, Japan would swiftly conquer the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and critically, the oil-rich Dutch East Indies. They would establish their Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, this fortified defensive perimeter, securing the resources they needed to become self-sufficient and sustain a longer war if necessary.
So Pearl Harbor wasn't the main goal, it was the enabler.
It was the necessary first step to enable the Southern operation. Yamamoto was also quite visionary about naval warfare. He understood, maybe earlier than many admirals in other navies, that the age of the battleship was ending.
He focused on aircraft carriers.
Yes. He saw carriers with their long-range air power as the true heart of a modern navy. His primary targets at Pearl Harbor weren't necessarily the battleships, but the American aircraft carriers. Sink those, and you cripple the U.S. Navy's ability to project power across the Pacific for months, maybe years.
And taking out Pearl Harbor also helped with the Philippines.
Definitely. The Philippines, under U.S. control and commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, sat right on the flank of Japan's planned drive south. Neutralizing the main U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor would prevent reinforcements from reaching the Philippines quickly, making their capture much easier and faster.
How did they plan to achieve the surprise? That seems key.
Absolutely critical. Yamamoto demanded meticulous planning and absolute secrecy. They relied heavily on intelligence gathered by spies on the ground in Hawaii.
Like the spy Kakio Yoshua.
Yes. He posed as a consular official, but spent months gathering detailed reconnaissance. He confirmed ship movements, security procedures, reportedly even went scuba diving in the harbor to check torpedo nets. He noted how lax security often was, how planes were sometimes clustered together on the airfields, making them easy targets, how anti-aircraft guns weren't always manned or supplied with ammunition.
So they had good intel. How did the strike force approach?
The strike force itself, the Kido Butai, consisted of 6 aircraft carriers under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. To maintain surprise, they took a very unusual route.
Which route?
A northern route across the Pacific. Much stormier, less traveled, and critically not regularly patrolled by American reconnaissance planes. They sailed under complete radio silence. They even changed their naval codes right before the operation, making it impossible for U.S. code breakers, even if they intercepted signals, to decipher them in time.
Meanwhile, what was the thinking in the U.S. command in Hawaii?
Complacency is the word that comes up again and again. U.S. intelligence overwhelmingly believed any Japanese attack would come much closer to Japan, probably against British Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, maybe the Philippines.
They didn't think Hawaii was a likely target.
Very few believe Japan had the capability or the audacity to launch a major carrier strike across thousands of miles of ocean against Pearl Harbor itself. It seemed too risky, too far-fetched.
And this affected local defenses.
Critically, the Army commander in Hawaii, General Walter C. Short, was more concerned about sabotage than air attack. There is a large population of Japanese ancestry in Hawaii, about 160,000 people. Short worried about potential espionage or sabotage from within.
So what did he do?
Following orders aimed at preventing sabotage and making aircraft easier to guard, Short ordered the planes on the airfields parked close together, wingtip to wingtip.
Which made them perfect targets for bombing.
Tragically, yes. Exactly what the Japanese pilots wanted. And the anti-aircraft ammunition was often kept locked up in depots to prevent theft or misuse, meaning it wasn't immediately available when the attack came.
And what about Yamamoto's main target, the U.S. carriers?
In a final, crucial stroke of luck for the Americans and terrible luck for Yamamoto's plan, all three aircraft carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet were absent from Pearl Harbor on December 7th.
Where were they?
The Enterprise and Lexington were out at sea, delivering fighter planes to Wake Island and Midway Island, respectively reinforcing those outlying bases. The Saratoga was on the U.S. West Coast, undergoing repairs and maintenance. Yamamoto's primary targets weren't there.
So the attack launches, December 7th, 1941, Sunday morning.
The first wave struck just before 8x0 Hawaii time. The surprise was total. The code sent back to the fleet was Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, signaling complete surprise had been achieved.
What kind of weapons did they use?
Specially modified torpedoes, designed to run in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, slammed into the battleships moored along Ford Island Battleship Row. Dive bombers dropped armor-piercing bombs converted from naval shells, aiming for the battleship's decks.
The destruction was immense, wasn't it?
Devastating. The USS Arizona took a direct bomb hit to its forward magazine. It exploded catastrophically and sank in minutes, taking over 1,100 crewmen, with it nearly half the total U.S. deaths that day. Other battleships, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, were sunk or heavily damaged. The planes clustered on the airfields were strafed and bombed, wiped out on the ground.
How many waves attacked?
Two main waves. The first had about 183 planes, the second about 170. They hit military airfields across Oahu as well as the ships in the harbor.
Could the Americans fight back effectively?
Very little initially. The surprise was too complete. Anti-aircraft fire was slow to get started, often ineffective without proper ammunition or coordination. Some pilots managed to get airborne but were heavily outnumbered.
How long did the attack last?
About 90 minutes. By the time the second wave withdrew, the damage was staggering. 19 ships sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships, 188 aircraft destroyed, another 159 damaged, and tragically, 2,403 American servicemen killed and over 1,100 wounded.
What about Japanese losses?
Incredibly light, testament to the surprise achieved. They lost only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines that had tried to infiltrate the harbor before the air attack. Fewer than 100 Japanese personnel were killed. Tactically, it was a stunning success for Japan. But, and this is a huge but, the victory was deeply flawed strategically.
Why flawed?
Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the carrier strike force, made a controversial decision. His junior officers, like the brilliant flight leader Mitsuo Fuchida, urged him to launch a third wave.
A third wave to hit what?
To hit the targets they'd missed in the first 2 waves, crucially. The naval repair yards, the submarine base, and most importantly, the massive fuel storage tanks, the oil depots.
Why didn't Nagumo launch the third wave?
Nagumo was more cautious, perhaps more traditional in his thinking than Yamamoto. He knew he'd achieve surprise, but he worried about lingering American planes, potential submarines. He feared risking his precious carriers, the core of Japan's naval power, in a third strike where surprise was lost. He decided they'd achieved enough and ordered the fleet to withdraw.
And missing those secondary targets was a huge mistake.
A colossal mistake in hindsight. By leaving the repair facilities intact, the U.S. could salvage and repair many of the damaged ships much faster than expected. Leaving the submarine base untouched allowed the U.S. submarine fleet, which would prove devastatingly effective against Japanese shipping later, to operate freely from Pearl Harbor. And leaving the fuel depots untouched was perhaps the biggest error. Millions of barrels of oil, essential for the U.S. fleet's operations across the Pacific, remained available. If those tanks had gone up, the U.S. Navy might have been forced to withdraw all the way back to California, buying Japan even more time.
So Yamamoto's primary targets, the carriers, were missed because they were absent. And his critical secondary targets, the fuel and repair yards, were missed because Nagumo withdrew too soon.
Exactly. The perfect, crippling knockout blow that Yamamoto had gambled everything on. It hadn't quite landed perfectly. Japan had achieved surprise, inflicted terrible damage, but failed to destroy the core elements needed for the U.S. Pacific Fleet to recover and fight back much sooner than anticipated.
And the political effect in the U.S.
It was the opposite of what some in Japan might have hoped. Instead of demoralizing America, the sneak attack enraged and united a previously divided, largely isolationist nation. Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan the next day, which passed almost unanimously. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, honoring the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States. Pearl Harbor didn't just start a Pacific War. It instantly turned the ongoing conflicts in Europe and Asia into a single global world war. #outrobro.
So we get to the end of this, and it really is fascinating. Japan pulls off this incredible tactical surprise, exactly what Yamamoto planned for his gamble.
A textbook military operation in many ways.
But they failed to hit the targets that really mattered for the long term. The carriers, which weren't there, and crucially, the fuel depots and repair yards, which Nagumo decided not to risk a third wave for.
That failure fundamentally undermined the entire strategic purpose of the attack, which was to buy that indispensable 6-month window to secure the southern resource area without effective American interference. By leaving the infrastructure and, critically, the fuel intact, they allowed the U.S. to begin recovery almost immediately.
And looking back at the diplomacy, it's just crushing to see how it failed. This cycle of mutual suspicion.
It's a real tragedy of miscommunication and mistrust. The U.S. side, relying heavily on those magic intercepts, saw confirmation of their worst fears about Japanese intentions.
Even when the intercepts weren't entirely accurate or were misinterpreted.
Right, the bias was already there, and this reliance on intercepted messages, combined with Hornbeck's influence, led them to dismiss the genuine desperation coming from Prime Minister Konoe.
And ignoring Ambassador Gru's warnings from Tokyo.
Exactly. Gru understood the internal pressures, the risk of the military taking over completely. By rejecting Konoe's pleas for a summit, by insisting on demands they knew the military would never accept, Washington inadvertently pulled the rug out from under the civilian peace faction.
And empowered Tojo.
They essentially handed the reins to the hardliners, making the military option the only one left on the table for Japan, given the oil embargo's deadline.
So when you put it all together for our listeners,
Yeah.
what's the big takeaway? Pearl Harbor wasn't just a random bolt from the blue.
Not at all. It wasn't random, and it wasn't irrational from the perspective of the Japanese leadership at that specific moment, however flawed their assumptions were.
It was the culmination of decades of history.
Decades of Japan's drive to modernize, its embrace of expansionism fueled by nationalism and resource scarcity, its growing frustration with perceived Western obstruction.
The immediate pressures. The quagmire in China draining resources. The devastating oil embargo creating an existential deadline.
And finally, the breakdown of diplomacy, riddled with mistrust, poor intelligence analysis, and missed signals. All these factors converged, creating a situation where Japan's leaders, particularly the military, which now held effective power, felt backed into a corner, believing that striking first, however risky, was their only chance for national survival.
It shows how these huge historical shocks are often the result of these complex intersecting pressures building up over time until something finally snaps.
Absolutely. Resource constraints, potent ideologies clashing, communication failures, they all feed into that critical moment where one side decides the risk of acting is less than the risk of inaction.
Which leads to our final provocative thought, I suppose.
Well, Yamamoto knew. He knew Japan couldn't win a long war against America's industrial might. His entire strategy rested on that perfect, crippling first strike to buy time and maybe, just maybe, force a negotiated peace.
But the strike wasn't perfect. The carriers were missed, the oil was left untouched.
So here's the question to ponder. From the moment Nagumo's planes turned back after the second wave, leaving Pearl Harbor's infrastructure largely intact, was the war already lost for Japan? Was their fate sealed in that instant, regardless of the victories they achieved in the following 6 months? And if so, what does that tell us about the ultimate futility of trying to overcome overwhelming industrial disadvantage with purely tactical brilliance or surprise?